Good morning, Jacy. How are you?
Good morning. I'm doing well. It's springtime here in Chicago, so I got to go to the
Yeah,
Botanic Gardens, and that was lovely.
it looks beautiful. A perfect antidote to a lockdown year, maybe. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
sounds good. Thank you so much for making the time to join this series of Sentientist Conversations. I was just saying, it seems odd that this is the first conversation we've had because I've followed your work so closely. We've had a few text-based conversations online before, so it's great to have the chance to talk properly. And as this is a series of conversations about the two deepest philosophical questions: what's real, how should we understand the universe, and what matters morally. And I have a particular bias because I'm trying to frame, recast, and build community around this idea of sentientism, which in a sense says, when it comes to what's real, we should take a naturalistic approach that uses evidence and reason. And when it comes to what matters, the clue is in the name, that we should have compassion for or moral consideration for every sentient being, any being that has the capacity to experience things, particularly suffering or flourishing. But I'm talking to people in these conversations who agree and disagree with the philosophy. So it'll be fascinating to hear your personal story. And
Wonderful.
so much of your work, of course, resonates with all those themes as well. So it's really looking forward to the conversation. But before we get into those deep questions, how would you best introduce yourself and your work for people who don't know you?
Sure. So very briefly, I've had a utilitarian philosophy since I was a kid. Wanted to maximize the net happiness I created in the world. That led me to nascent kind of effective altruism movement. It led me to a Buddhist forum, which maybe we can talk about online. Whereas I grew up in rural Texas in the deep South, so I was getting to know people elsewhere in the world who are interested in these big aims, big sentientist goals and projects. So that eventually led me to do an undergraduate in neuroscience. And during that degree, I was helping set up a lot of kind of nascent community building organizations like the High Impact Network, trying to popularize this idea of doing the most good. And then I started at Animal Charity Evaluators, which is similar to GiveWell, evaluates charities and recommends them in the context of helping animals. After a year and a half there, and I'd been on the board for a long time as well, I started an organization called Sentience Institute, which is a spinoff of the Effective Altruism Foundation, where we do research on the most effective strategies to expand humanity's moral circle. And at that point as well, I was starting to write a book called The End of Animal Farming, which came out in 2018. And that argues that we are moving towards an animal-free food system and discusses a bit of why we should go there, but mostly how we will get there. And since then, I've now started a PhD. I was doing research and writing, but didn't have the graduate degree that most people I was engaging with had. So now I'm in academia at the University of Chicago, getting a PhD in sociology and really getting a generalist sense of social science and social theory to inform moral circle expansion and other important phenomena.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. And I think we'll come back to this later, but it seems for many of my guests that the central problem we're facing is really one of human psychology and sociology more than technical challenges. So I can see the logic behind you focusing on the social sciences. Thank you. That's a brilliant introduction. So the first of the two deep questions we ask is what's real? So for many of my guests, that's a story about whether they grew up in a naturalistic, atheistic, scientific sort of context, or one that was more spiritual and supernatural or religious, and how that side of their philosophies changed over their life, partly because that links to the second question about morality. So yeah, you can wind the clock back as far as you like, but it'd be fascinating to know your personal story and where you've got to now on that aspect of philosophy.
Sure. I grew up around churches, Baptist, a bit of Catholic, some other denominations, but I wasn't from a particularly religious family. Both my parents were from more religious families, and they were just fairly agnostic. I went to community events. We would have these things called lock-ins, which sound a bit weird for people who aren't used to them. Children go to a church, spend the night, and they're locked in. And it's weird that's how they decide to name it, but it's for safety and everything. But the kids aren't running about.
In the UK and Ireland, a lock-in is where the pub landlord illegally lets you stay in the pub after hours, and you pull the curtains and turn the lights off so the police can't detect it. So it's a bit different, but
pretty similar. Okay, yeah. Differences too. So that was fun. Engaged a lot with it, but I wasn't even told Santa was real growing up. I was encouraged to have this more scientific discovery and an independent mindset. So I never became particularly religious. I became a utilitarian when I was 12 years old, and that was the guiding philosophy.
Really?
And the sort of ethical principle is a big part of religion. But I was also very interested in Buddhism, their theory of suffering, how it's generated in the world, not the supernatural, any semblance of reincarnation, but that was appealing to me, just the explanation of how to live your life in a happy way and avoid that suffering. And then some Buddhists want to extend that and reduce suffering in that same way for other sentient beings. So that compelled me. I was near Houston growing up. It was about an hour and a half or 2 hour drive. So I did go to a Buddhist temple there at one point. There was no Buddhist temples in the woods of East Texas, but overall, mostly stuck with the kind of the academic angle on things. In terms of what's real for morality, I was definitely a moral realist at that point. It was a very intuitive starting point, though I'm now an anti-realist. I also simulation argument, brain in a vat kind of thing, or the butterfly dream, if you've heard of that from like Chinese philosophy, was getting some of those semblances of what could be out there. I think they're very legitimate questions about what's real in a big picture sense. And religion is just one way to answer that. There are many others about what happened before the Big Bang. Where does our universe as we know it fit into any bigger picture of multiverses or universes that exist? But I was always on that track. I never really went back and forth with any modern world religions.
Yeah, interesting. And the Buddhist angle is fascinating because for many of the people who have a broad sense of compassion, particularly one that goes across species, and that has an emotional resonance to them and an intellectual resonance to them, Buddhism has a lot of attraction too. And there's again, as with most religions, there's an enormous dizzying variety of, flavors and interpretations. And Buddhism is one that I think it's remarkably common for people to take the philosophical angle, the understanding of suffering, the position of our own psychological approach to that suffering and the role that can play, that people find, very attractive. But at the same time, they don't necessarily accept the supernatural elements, the karma, the reincarnation, and some of those other sort of more esoteric stuff as well. So it's fascinating. When people think about broadly compassionate ways of thinking, Buddhism is one that resonates for many people.
You've read it, but Why Buddhism is True, which sounds religious, but it's really just about why Buddhism has a compelling and useful theory of suffering.
Yeah, I haven't read the book, but I've heard it talked about. I need to put it on the list. Yeah. So it sounds like you describe your worldview probably as naturalistic now, in that you don't necessarily have a set view of what reality is, but the approach you'd go about working that out would be a naturalistic one of evidence and reason and
certainly evidence,
probabilistically developing beliefs and so on.
Evidence, reason, probabilistic, all those things seem accurate. Naturalistic perhaps has a connotation that there is nothing supernatural, and I think that's an empirical question on which I remain uncertain. I think likely there is nothing of the deific category of bearded man dictating the clock of the universe, setting it and letting it go in motion, or actively intervening. However, you might think it's supernatural to think of something like a multiverse, or to think of some history before the Big Bang, or to think of us being a simulation of a larger society that is very strange and feels supernatural in many ways. So insofar as it's an empirical question, I remain uncertain, but insofar as it's an approach, I do think that that has the best track record, and therefore I follow the evidence, the reason, and the probabilities.
Yeah, makes sense. And it also seems like that wasn't, for many of my guests, it was quite a difficult journey to get to that point, because they came from a place where religion was very important to their family or the society, and it had certain rules and regulations and approaches and cultural resonance that was difficult to move from. But it didn't sound like there was much of that stress or strain in your path, because you started out with this sort of fairly open, naturalistic context anyway. And
it wasn't challenging. And I'm very thankful to my parents for, like the Santa thing. I was never told about tooth fairies or Easter bunnies or anything like that. I was perhaps told of them as stories. As you were saying, the first question I ask people when they tell me that they're religious and we start to have a discussion about it is, okay, what does that mean to you? In what ways are you a Christian? And some will talk about community, or they'll talk about moral principles, or they'll talk about the supernatural. And oftentimes I ask them, like, okay, are you fully on board with the metaphysical claims? Like, the best explanation of the universe is you could say, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient, godlike figure. And they'll often answer different things for each of those. And it's weird to acknowledge that. But no, personally, I haven't really had a starting place to struggle with, unless you consider agnosticism itself a starting place. Certainly it could lead to bias.
Yeah, makes sense. Thank you. So the second question you've touched on, or you've hinted at already, which is what matters morally. And it's often a question that people who have a naturalistic way of thinking or a non-religious way of thinking are asked is, okay, if there isn't a deity that's going to judge you, if there isn't a list of commandments or a holy book that tells you what to do, if there isn't a heaven and a hell, is there any grounding for morality whatsoever? And you talked about before moral realism and moral anti-realism. So it'd be interesting to know your personal story. Again, you can wind the clock back and tell us where you came from and where you've got to now in terms of the grounding of your morality.
I didn't know about the school of academic utilitarianism and that whole philosophy. It just came to me as the natural consequence of critically thinking about morality and trying to reduce the Ten Commandments, for example, to, okay, what actually matters within them? How do you adjudicate between them? Often we have these idioms and we war them against each other. Like in social theory, you could say opposites attract, but birds of a feather flock together. And how do you ever know what happens in situations where those are in conflict? I was similarly frustrated as a kid with the Ten Commandments and other heuristics for morality. So when I went to that, I viewed it as an objective sense of, okay, I've taken these things that everyone agrees are general moral rules and reduced them to an objectively correct moral system. In fact, I have an old essay from my school days when I said something along the lines of, I don't have the proof written up for this quite yet. Like, I'm working on it. Don't worry.
There isn't enough space in the margin, but it's coming. And this is at 12 years old.
Yeah. I probably wrote that essay when I was 13. But I became a utilitarian when I was 12. And I just saw that very naturally. And I was on a utilitarianism forum when I was 14 and called Philosophy, which is now defunct, I think, but used to be a very active engagement before we had effective altruism and some of these other forums. And in that, I was like asking people for the proof of utility. I was like, hey, I'm really struggling with it. Like, what have you all come up with? What is the answer to it? And I just struggled with that for a long time. And Brian Tomasic and a few other people in the utilitarian community were adopting this more anti-realist standpoint, where basically the main argument is just that why suppose an out there, an objective, a mind-independent moral reality when that's not needed to describe the data we have about the universe? So our observations, our senses, our five senses coming in and our logic and reason, none of that requires any sense of an external morality. So facing that argument and not having any reason, any explanatory benefit of having an objective morality, I dropped it and switched to moral anti-realism at some point in my teenage years. And since then, I've written more about it and tried to defend it, and also some other similar views. Actually, I think consciousness and sentience have some similar properties in that they aren't objectively circumscribed, in the sense that it's up to us to decide exactly which mental phenomenon to put in that category. Yeah. Often people will just make a general gesticulation at what it's like to be something, or Ned Block, I believe, said it's like jazz. If you don't know what it is, you're never going to.
But I can't explain it to you.
Yeah. So I've come to this general anti-realist standpoint about moral truths, and that's where I'm at now. I'd be open to changing my mind.
Thank you. And how do you? One of the reasons I think people jump to a moral realism, whether it's a supernatural religious moral realism, whether the moral truth is defined by the essence of a deity, whatever it is, or even a non-supernatural one that just still thinks there's some sort of externally defined moral truth. One reason people cling to that, I think unnecessarily, is because they're nervous that without that externally defined moral truth, it's similar to giving up the religious way of thinking morally, that you're just going to be completely ungrounded. There is no morality. You almost go to a sort of extreme relativism where anything goes, or things are just arbitrarily constructed by whoever happens to have the power to negotiate whatever moral system. How do you avoid that sort of either nihilist or relativistic place, given you've given up a sort of perfect grounding of moral realism?
Yeah, how perfect is it if it's being dictated from some deity? Often that feels dissatisfying upon reflection.
And the point one of my previous guests, Yasmin Mohammed, made is she said, Jamie, you're implying that a deity giving you a moral set of standards is objective, but they're just as arbitrary because they're fabricated. It's an illusory comfort. Yeah.
Objective, my big philosophical view on almost everything is that we need to be really precise about our definitions to get precise answers. And with objectivity, we need to be clear about what would constitute objectivity. Mostly people say mind independence, where it would exist, even if there weren't humans, or you could say in general, moral agents out here formulating and thinking about morality. That's what it means for moral truth to exist. But that leaves ambiguous. Does the deity count as one of these moral agents thinking about and contemplating morality? I was listening also to Maddie Wilkes, who was a previous guest of yours and has been a co-author. I thought she put it really brilliantly, and with the comparison to would you go out and kill people, which I think you said that you knew somebody who said if they didn't have religion, they would go out and kill people. But to me, that's been compelling. I probably don't have nearly as many conversations about religion as you do. But when I bring that up, they're like, okay, yeah, of course, there's something else out there. Yeah. For me, I usually have the conversations with moral realists who aren't appealing to any divine or supernatural truth and are just saying, without that mind-independent truth, what would you go out and do? Or for consciousness, and for my view, which is called consciousness eliminativism, you could call it conscious anti-realism. It's pretty close. People just use different terms to describe it. I say, okay, if there's no objective fact as to who's conscious and who's sentient, that still doesn't mean I'm going to go out and and kill any bunny rabbits or more marginally sentient entities, we could say fish or someone whom we think has less sentience. There's still a clear, compelling reason to me. It's just not an objective, mind-independent, metaphysical one. So I think it's a level up. It's the next step from rejecting the supernatural truth is rejecting even the mind-independent truth. And then think you get to a very comfortable position, hopefully, where you're fine with your own morality, you accept its subjectivity, but also its compellingness and the fact that it provides strong reason to go out and be a good person in the world.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, and in a way, you've hinted at part of the reason you reject a purely relativistic or nihilistic view is one that it comes back to recognizing sentience or consciousness as something that is morally important, and the quality of those experiences are morally important. And I find the same thing, and I'm probably being a bit too vague in my philosophical terms as an amateur, but I agree. I'm not a moral realist in the sense that there are platonic moral truths floating out there for us to discover in some way. But at the same time, I am quite comfortable explaining that my morality is naturalistically grounded in an understanding, an imperfect understanding of sentient beings and what the nature of sentience. And in a really common sense way, I don't like suffering. I'm pretty sure you don't either. And morality is just the decision to care about the experiences of others. So it's not perfectly moral realist, because I think before sentient beings existed, I don't think there was any morality. It just didn't exist at all. There was no being to conceive of it, and there was no being to be harmed or to suffer or to experience. But at the same time, so it's grounded, but it's like a soft realism, or I don't know how you describe it, but I think it's probably roughly similar. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on that framing of it.
I think that's anti-realism, but the issue in the philosophical literature is that both sides have a Mott and Bailey where they generally say any reasonable view they would put in their category. But then when they retreat, they have a more specific thing in mind. I think we need to unpack the word grounded. I certainly, when I was thinking about utilitarianism, I was going through a reflective process, a rational process, a reasoned, a grounded, all these sorts of things. Thought experiments come into play, empirical experience, being out in the world and seeing suffering firsthand, either in your own mind or in the lives of others, especially extreme suffering. I think a lot of negative utilitarians or negative leaning moral frameworks see that as a particularly important thing to engage in and accept just how devastating that is, because that's perhaps asymmetrically compelling compared to the positive valence in the world. I think all these things are data and they're useful and they're nice to discuss. I just don't think that you're ever going to come up with a proof, something that transcends. If somebody says, oh yeah, I've been through all those thought experiments, I've thought about extreme suffering, I know what torture is, I've been tortured myself maybe, like they could accept all these things and still come to but ultimately I'm let's say libertarian, so they think freedom is the fundamental value, rather than a utilitarian who thinks happiness or preference satisfaction is. I don't think there's then any trouncing, there's then any QED, sorry, you're wrong. That's what I mean by anti-realism.
No,
but there's a convergence, there's something that develops, there's something that can be appealed to across cultures. All of these things are in the realist direction, even if they don't mean a metaphysical realism.
Yeah, agreed. And some of these things almost become definitional conversations rather than conversations about the nature of reality as well. And I agree. In a sense, ultimately, our own morality is a choice we can take. I could choose to think that suffering is a good thing if I want to. Hopefully other people would constrain me, but
hopefully.
Hopefully. So you also hinted at the other key question that I'd like to talk about here. So one is whether it's grounding or a basis or a rationale or for what we think morality is or what we decide is good or bad. The second question is that one of moral scope or moral considerability. That's another area where you've written on extensively, I know, as a focus of much of your work. So again, it would be interesting to know your personal journey there as you went through extending your own moral considerability scope. And again, was that something that happened in parallel with you thinking through utilitarianism or?
Yeah, I have perhaps a simple and uninteresting journey in that I just became a utilitarian and then everything fell in place from there. I'd say initially I certainly wasn't as focused on non-humans, on animals. I did become a vegetarian pretty quickly, just with a internet website. It was the early stages of the internet, so utilitarians were starting to get together and animal activists and vegans were starting to share information online. So I just saw some kind of bullet points. It wasn't a video, not one of these gory images or investigations. It was just like a chicken lives on a space smaller than the sheet of typing paper and a few things like that. So then I went vegetarian as soon as I read that. It seemed like a pretty clear gestatory calculus. However, I continued to focus on human issues, and Give was also getting started around this time. So I interned there and was focused more on global poverty issues. I saw AI risks as very appealing because of the risk of human extinction and how large the stakes were there. But as I was graduating from my bachelor's, I knew that I needed to get a full-time job and have a clearer sense of what EAs would call cause prioritization between these different areas. And when I just put pen to paper and looked at, for example, what sort of discount ratio would you need from human to animal suffering like a chicken in order to justify working on human issues, I just couldn't see plausible reasons why my ratio should be low enough that it would need to be to justify working on those human issues.
Yeah, makes sense. And it's interesting with the utilitarianism thing, because for some people, the extension of moral consideration beyond humans is baked into utilitarianism. And you go back to Bentham, for example, the question is, can they suffer? But I'm surprised at the number of utilitarians who seem to find a way back to just focusing on human utility. And it's interesting, you didn't follow that path. You stuck with it and thought about sentience or consciousness more broadly, right, pretty much from the start. I don't know if you've got a perspective about why it is that a sentiocentric scope of compassion roughly isn't hard coded into utilitarianism, and why so many utilitarians seem to narrow it back down again.
Yeah, I can certainly steelman it, and I've had many of those conversations. In fact, much of my time, circa 2013 to 2017, was trying to persuade more both animal activists and vegans and sentiocentrists to adopt effectiveness and effective altruists to adopt sentiocentrism in their moral circle. And I think a lot of it is bias, even in myself. It just felt very weird to be the sort of person who devotes their life or a substantial portion of their life to helping other species. I don't want to say it feels like betrayal or being a traitor in some way.
Species traitor.
Yeah, but there is a sort of lack of prestige. Sometimes it's perceived. I know certainly growing up in Texas, I didn't know any vegans growing up. And what I knew about vegetarianism was Lisa Simpson and these very sentimental, touchy-feely, warm, fuzzy. And I think a lot of that continues until you really engage with the arguments and start to see, hey, there's a really logical, mathematical sensibility behind this. So a lot of people still have that flavor. And I think that can lead to dismissing it. No, I'm not that sort of person. I think the far future arguments can muddy the waters in that either they first are, okay, I'm going to think about all these future beings. And then for them, that means humans. And that outweighs any near-term factor for me. I know one argument, I fortunately never run into it anymore, but used to run into it a lot, is if we're helping animals, they don't go out and help other animals. So if I go out and help the global poor, there's a multiplicative effect because they help their communities, they have children, it continues to future generations, what have you. But they thought that this just didn't exist for animal issues. When, if you have any conversation with an animal activist, they're saying, no, it's sure, of course, that cow wasn't going out and having conversations. In fact, my activism is basically meaning that cow doesn't exist. They aren't born onto a factory farm. Instead, we're cultivating a moral sensibility within the human population. And that does have all these nonlinear dynamics that you see in global health and global economic intervention. So I think some of those arguments have been persuasive. There's still a challenge. The far future stuff comes into play when it's convenient, but people still end up donating to give well. I think a lot of that is just the natural starting place. And I think overall, it's important to keep in mind, though, that like the community is doing really well in the sense that it has the highest portion, at least in this like effective altruism survey that I used to help run and other people are still continuing to run, of vegetarians and vegans among like virtually any subgroup of the human population. They're doing really well. And then I think it'd be really difficult for any organization or collective to adopt an extremely large, let's say over 80% sentiocentrism or veganism or something, if that's not their main focus, because it feels quite cumbersome in Western society right now as an identity. It feels like you're taking on a lot of weight. There's only a certain set of ideas you can keep up with and share and have as your ensemble for a community. And that one just seems very crowded.
Yeah, exactly. And it's difficult to resist when you've got that Bentham quote to keep banging people over the head with, So.
That's really lucky. I think a lot about the alternative history. What if the first books on utilitarianism were written a little differently, or what Ashoka and India didn't have this cultivation of vegetarianism and in their religion and things like this. I think we could see pretty big changes, or even Pythagoras, if vegetarianism hadn't continued to be a small thing throughout basically the history of Western civilization.
Yeah, and it's a tangent, but that's one thing I've found fascinating as I've been working on this sentientism idea, is finding how deep those roots are, both of naturalistic thinking and roughly sentiocentric thinking as well. And one of my favorite finds was the blind Arab philosopher poet called Al-Mari, who I think was born in something like 957, over 1,000 years ago. And his quotes are explicitly clear. He's challenging the existence of deities. He's using a naturalistic approach, and he's talking explicitly about the immorality of dairy farming. And this is 1,000 years ago, so deep ancient roots.
Yeah. One of the things that I'm learning in my PhD studies, because I'm going back to this kind of history of social theory, is that just everything's been said before. We think of, for example, division of labor as being this novel, really important concept of the Industrial Revolution, maybe even not even Adam Smith, but then getting up to Durkheim in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Oh, that's when they thought of this idea. But no, if you go back to Plato, the Republic talks extensively about the division of labor as how cities are formed. There's kind of nothing new under the sun, at least unless you're in a very specific niche. Like now in factory farming, we can have conversations people have never had before.
Yeah, agree. And one of the other things you've touched on is this distinction between is cause prioritization, right? Because on one hand, that's an extremely difficult multi-dimensional challenge that, again, you've done a lot of work on, and the effective altruism movement focuses on hard as well. If we want to do the most good, where should we focus our efforts and our resources given they're scarce? And that's a really difficult challenge, but I see it as slightly distinct from the scope of moral considerability in the first place, because there's this sense that, fine, you can set a broad moral scope and then prioritize within that. Mm-hmm. But if you've set your moral scope wrong in the first place, you never, the entities outside of that scope never even get a chance to be prioritized. And you can actually willfully and directly cause harm because they're not even in the scope of your consideration. Whereas if you have, in my view, your moral scope set appropriately, i.e. in a sentiocentric way, even if you prioritize human causes within that, you would still see needlessly causing suffering and death to any sentient being as a moral wrong, and therefore you would make efforts to try and avoid doing that. So that's partly why I've tried to keep this reframing of sentientism as very philosophically pluralistic and neutral on cause priorities. And it literally just says, here's the scope of your moral consideration. Prioritize within that as you like. And I'd like you to do that in a naturalistic, logical way, of course, but the most important thing is the scope of moral consideration. And even be pluralistic about the ethical system. And most people, when they think of sentientism or sentiocentrism, often will think singer, rider, maybe utilitarianism and follow the path you've taken. And I'm sympathetic to that as well, or at least in a consequentialist sense, if not strictly utilitarian. But I think you can also be sentiocentric and take a deontological view, or be like a Christine Korsgaard Kantian, or take a rights perspective, or even a virtue ethics approach, which still uses sentience as the characteristic for which entities count in your moral consideration. So I don't know if that works, but I quite like the idea of it being pluralistic, because I think that setting that scope is the most important thing and the worst thing to get wrong. And it also means I can stay out of all the really difficult problems. And I could just say, yep, fight over that stuff. I'm not a philosopher, but at least get the scope.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the approach that my brilliant co-author, Efe Paez, and myself take in our Futures paper that came out just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, it was great. I love that.
A wide moral circle. We argue for this phenomenon of moral circle expansion, both as a normative goal of humanity, but also as a description of history and of individual psychology. And we draw a distinction between, there could be many different moral circles, but we focus on attitudinal and behavioral moral circles, the ones that you explicitly endorse, self-report. Again, I want this really concrete operationalization. And then the ones that are reflected in your behavior, which could be your diet, for example. And then you might even think of a stronger version of the behaviorist one, which is prioritization. You can in your day-to-day behavior, in your easy behavior, let's say, like your diet, maybe in that way you have a very wide moral circle, but then in your career moral circle, it's narrower if you decide to work on global poverty or something. And it is important to disentangle them. Sometimes it's a matter of activism. It's nice to overwhelm people. I find that in particular with young folks who are eager for some cause to rally around and get excited about, it's nice to just throw the kitchen sink at them and see, here's utilitarianism, here's the wide moral circle, here's the practical projects we're working on, here are these things about artificial intelligence 10,000 years in the future, moral anti-realism, and this becomes like a aha moment more easily than just separating them and making them very diluted. And also sometimes it's a concern, well, you'll just get a lot of head nods. You'll say, like, oh yeah, of course, wide moral circle. And then they won't actually go out and do anything. So it's always striking a balance, but it's important to at least, it's like in social movements, we have moderate flanks and radical flanks. And there's some really great work showing that, for example, in the 1960s civil rights movement, these radical flanks seem to be really important and effective at pulling what we call the Overton window. So making the scope of normal ideas on a topic like civil rights, pulling that in a more radical direction, even if it's not going to get to where you actually are. If I go out on, NPR and talk about utilitarianism and artificial sentience, I'm not going to get many people fully towards where I am. But then maybe they'll think that, hey, this farmed animal concern, this wild animal concern isn't so crazy.
Yeah. And I think we'll come back to this when we talk about campaigns in the future. But one of my other previous guests, Corey Lee Wren, has done some great writing along similar lines around the animal advocacy and the vegan movements. And she's almost challenging the movement and says, look, you've almost got a bit too mainstream and a bit too corporate and a bit too ordinary. And she's, again, talking about the role of the radicals and the subversives and stretching that Overton window and bringing innovation in. And of course, there's downsides to that in terms of disruption and infighting and the narcissism of small differences. But there's value and positivity there as well in terms of innovation and freshness and representation and shifting that Overton window as well. Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that topic. One of the other things I'm interested in your thoughts on is about this link between the moral side and the naturalistic side as well. So the term sentientism, I think, was first used actually as a criticism by a chap called John Rodman, who was taking a biocentric or even an ecocentric perspective and saying, look, sentientism is a discrimination because you're discriminating against non-sentient beings, to which I and ultimately Singer and Ryder and others have said, yeah, exactly. It's the only moral discrimination because we're including all beings that are capable of suffering, and the ones outside don't care because they experience nothing at all. So it was first used in that context. And then I think Singer and Richard Ryder and others initially did frame sentientism as a naturalistic way of thinking. And Richard Ryder was, in some of his writing, explicitly setting it against a religious morality and rationale and saying, look, here's a scientifically based ethic. But in its use in academia, Sentiocentrism and Sentientism drifted to become pretty much the same thing. So they came to be used as a term just to describe the scope of moral consideration based on sentience without really referring to this naturalistic commitment as well. And at least in the popular movement I'm trying to amateurishly develop, I'm quite keen to have that naturalism built in as well. And you might see it as an analog to the distinction between an anthropocentric worldview and humanism, which is a naturalistic, non-religious movement that commits to universal human compassion. You might see sentiocentrism as here's your scope set by sentience, and sentientism can be the term we use for a naturalistic worldview that uses sentience. And one of the reasons, so some people will say, why is that naturalism important? And to me, one really interesting example is the biblical story, or the Abrahamic story of Abraham and Isaac, right? Where Abraham had love and compassion, presumably for his son, but was willing to kill his own son because a deity had told him to do it. And maybe that's a silly example or an extreme example, but I guess the point I draw from that is just having sentiocentric compassion isn't enough, because if for non-naturalistic reasons something can override that because there's a deistic authority or a need to comply and obey, or a set of somewhat arbitrary rules that were dreamed up 2,000 or 3,000 years ago by a guy in the desert, or whatever it was, or if even in a non-religious context, if something is granted more importance than the experiences of sentient beings, it could be a one-party state or an autocratic leader or something else. Again, compassion isn't enough. You need a naturalistic grounding as well. But do you think that link is useful? Because in a way that's going beyond moral circle expansion. It's also saying we need a commitment to naturalism as well. I don't know if you think that link's interesting or useful or...
Yeah, I think theoretically there definitely is a link. It's important. I think that's uncontested. I think the challenge is, one, it's very difficult to persist in a term that doesn't mean exactly what it etymologically means. So I understand that sentiocentrism would be the centering of sentience. And then sentientism, as it's usually used in the lineage of isms, would mean either discriminating based on sentience or caring about sentience in some way. And to me, those things seem like too similar to really disentangle in the collective dictionary vocabulary. That being said, if you can do it, and it's a niche community, so maybe you are able to do it more so, it does seem useful. I think it's important in general to have a lot of intersections with other movements. I think this is a big part of how movements grow. So again, since I'm using 1960s civil rights as an example, just the religion, the churches in the South in particular, are extremely important for infrastructure, for legitimacy, for a host of reasons. And similarly, I think for animal advocacy, you want to bring in certain collaborations and stick with them and develop communities. I love when just new organizations are like vegan doctors or libertarian animal rights activists or whatever. And one of those important ones that you and Alex O'Connor, and I don't know as much of this space, are working on is like this sort of aligning it with the naturalism, the humanism, the skepticism, the agnosticism, atheism. that bundle of ideas.
Agree. And I think religious organizations have an enormous role to play in the animal advocacy in this the sort of sentiocentric stance too. The Animal Interfaith Alliance, specific faith groups, the rich heritage there is within Jainism and Buddhism and Rastafarianism. And even people are doing good work within the Christian faith as well to talk about shifting from dominion towards reinterpreting stewardship in a more open, compassionate way as well. Yeah, I agree. Let many of the flowers bloom, and as long as they're working in that direction, then that's all good.
Yeah. So I'm hopeful. I don't know what will actually succeed. It's always hard to predict with these terms. It seems very similar to the bundling of effective and altruism. In the early days, we were also calling it like strategic altruism, because the core idea was that we wanted two words, one that expresses the rationality, the effectiveness, the reasonedness, etc. Evidence-based altruism was also a contender. And then one that expresses the doing good, the plan. And obviously, these both have challenges. And one of the issues with effectiveness is that you're saying other things aren't effective.
Yeah.
One of the issues with altruism is that it has these touchy-feely, warm, fuzzy connotations. Some people don't feel very altruistic in their philanthropy. They think of it as a very, again, reasoned and kind of realist approach where they're saying, no, this is just what I should be doing. Maybe they feel obligated. Maybe they feel it's morally correct and reasoned. And the word altruism might put them off in some way. But with carving out these terms, they always are going to have imperfections, even moral circle expansion. For example, we don't want to just continue expanding it forever. We scope out in that paper the phenomenon as being quite inclusive. We say that you could further extend it to all living beings, biocentrism, but I'm not personally as excited about it. I think that also comes with disentangling consciousness and sentience, as I was alluding to earlier. I think sentience boils down to four things. There's goal-oriented behavior. There's mood-like states, which that's a bit complicated, but it means like the fact that if you shake up a honeybee hive, they become more pessimistic, they become agitated. If you then give them an ambiguous liquid that might be sweet, it might be bitter, they like sweet, they dislike bitter, they're more likely to think that it's bitter. They have a cognitive bias based on an emotional agitation. I think that's something distinct. So mood-like state is an important second category. And there's complexity, just the general sophistication. If there's more going on, you can think of very simple entities that have some sort of mood and some sort of goal, but are just like a tiny computer program. We want that sophistication to be part of it. And then integration. So for example, with honeybees, there's an experiment where you're trying to teach them to associate a certain smell with a certain sight. They really struggle to do this outside of really predefined categories. They struggle to get the same integration across those because they seem to be occupying different parts of their mind. So anyway, you want some sort of integration. And I'm not putting those four forward as like the definitive, that's what sentience is and that's what matters. But we need to unpack that to then get a sense of, okay, is it living beings that matter? Or is it sentient? Or is it consciousness? We just need to be more precise about what mental phenomena would care.
Makes sense. And you make an interesting point about the expansion by itself isn't necessarily good, right? There might be a place you want to stop or slow down. And while we've talked a little bit about one obvious challenge to sentientism is you've gone too far, only humans matter, or maybe only humans and companion animals. The other challenge is exactly that is, okay, as I think Rodman said in 1977, sentientism doesn't go far enough. What about plants and rocks and rivers and ecosystems and habitats and the earth as Gaia? And your paper was interesting on that front because I think it reflected a sort of open-mindedness. It was almost, I think, saying you can go further if you like. But one of the frustrations that many of these conversations have centered on is that the mainstream environmental movement seems to have jumped from an anthropocentric view to one that's theoretically super generous in terms of its moral scope. You genuinely cares about the entire ecosystem and the planet, but still conveniently carves out trillions of very obviously sentient beings in the wild and in farms as well. And my previous guest, I haven't released it yet, but described it as being just another excuse for an anthropocentric perspective. It's not really ecocentric at all. It's just another way of reflecting human needs. So I think I share that. I don't mind if people want to be open-minded about going beyond sentience. If you want to think about blades of grass warranting some direct moral consideration, if you want to. Personally, I don't. I take quite a hard line. I think all of those other things are richly important instrumentally because of their impact on sentient beings. But if you want to go further, that's fine. But please don't ignore any of the very obviously sentient beings as you go through that. But so I don't know if you have a view on that sort of risk of expanding too far. But
yeah, we actually originally weren't going to put that in the paper, the risks of overexpansion, because it just doesn't seem that important. And if your goal is moral circle expansion, you don't want to have that narcissism of small differences. You want to cooperate. I want the other people to cooperate with me and accept that, hey, even if you don't care about, I think insects matter. Maybe not to that great an extent, but they're important. They exist in very large numbers. And if some animal advocate doesn't care about insects, I want them to give my view consideration and not promote, let's say, eating insects at a large scale as like a solution to the factory farming of birds and mammals and fish. But it's important to have those general dynamics, even if I philosophically and theoretically don't disagree with biocentrism. I think it's also true that in general, there's a limitation. There are limited resources and there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs, especially in selective attention. If somebody genuinely does care about ecosystems and collective entities out in the wild, you can have, I think, an engaging and interesting view that still cares a lot about the individual wild animals, but tries to integrate some sort of sophistication like that. Like, for example, you wouldn't end a suffering wild animal population. You would instead alleviate a lot of their suffering. They still have mixed lives, some good, some quite bad. And that's like a view that we can live with more, negotiate with, improve upon. Whereas if it's a selective attention and it's this fact that they're using these ecosystems, they're caring about them as a way of dismissing those trillions of wild animal individuals. That's where it becomes more challenging. So I try to accept when people are just saying, hey, we should include everything you say and more. I almost ask by a principle, by fiat. I don't want to oppose anyone who takes that. But if they're being selective, then I want to critique it. And another thing we touched on in the paper, and I don't mean to just repeat everything from it, is that moral circles are not circles. They are multidimensional blobs that have many holes and gradients and peninsulas that stick out. And that's inevitable. We're not going to have these neatly defined moral circles because even within sentience, there's a lot of ambiguity. And like I said, I have sort of 4 criteria. Other people have different ones. David Pierce, who's very thoughtful, very caring person. When these people go, I don't want to non-cooperate with in any way. He doesn't think artificial sentience is particularly likely or important, or I'm not sure about his exact view, but I still want to work with him. And I think he's considerate that many people in his social circles do think that's a important.
Yeah. That makes sense. And in a way, there's 2 distinct things in my mind. One is does it make sense to go beyond sentience? And the other one is what is sentience and which entities are likely to be sentient? And even people who agree that sentience is important, as you say, will disagree about where those boundaries are and which things might be sentient, and whether there's a question of degree of sentience and therefore degrees of moral consideration as well. And those are all fascinating questions. And many people who I think would agree with the sentientist stance when it comes to thinking about farmed animals still seem to have these blockers around taking some of those next steps. So, for example, considering the sentience of wild animals is a challenge that many people in the animal advocacy and vegan movements are uncomfortable about making. Again, partly because there's this sort of reverence for nature and a nervousness about human intervention and hubris, of course, which is understandable. Then there's the choice about the super simple animals, at which point, what degree of sentience. You mentioned insects and invertebrates, go down to sea sponges and so on. And so there's an open scientific question there as well, where people can take different judgments. And another really challenging one that you've just touched on already is substrate independence as well. Right? Is it conceivable that a non-biological entity, is artificial intelligence or robot of some sort, could achieve sentience as well? And that links to another topic that sentientism is irritatingly neutral on, because it doesn't really say a statement about the essential nature of sentience. It just says whatever it is, it matters morally. So what's your view about not just the definition of sentience, but actually what is it? What is its essence?
I would go back to the discussion of people have usually gestured at what it's like or some vague definition of the subjective experience. I think deictic definitions or ostensive definitions are defining it by example, just pointing to it's the commonality between smelling a mushroom, seeing the color red, using your mind's eye to visualize a red apple, feeling an emotion. It's unclear whether emotions are all valence. You might think happiness and suffering is one axis of valence, and there's another axis such as arousal. You can be highly aroused and looking around and either be anxious and nervous and bad and have a negative valence, or have a positive excitement, interested, curious emotion going on. So I would just go back to those 4 things.
That makes sense. But I guess, so maybe I should ask the question a slightly different way. Are you tempted by a sort of panpsychist type view of the ultimate essence of consciousness and sentience? Or my personal view is that it's most likely just to be a class of information processing, and that their consciousness is just what it feels like to run this particular type of information processing. So I have a much more sort of materialistic stance as well. Where are you on that? Again, it's not really relevant to whether we think sentience matters morally or not, but intellectually it's quite interesting to think about. And sentientists, have radically different views. There are much more illusionist or materialistic sentientists as well.
Yeah. Those 4 things that I mentioned, I see them as information processing. It's like how I'm defining them, because they're the things that when I imagine a bunch of different artificial intelligences, a bunch of different robots, they look different, they act different, on different substrates. Let's say some are built with silicon, the semiconductor in modern computers, but people figure out a way to do carbon-based artificial intelligence in some way, or they're built with genetic coding, or you can imagine all sorts of variations of artificial entities as a thought experiment, figuring out what exactly it is you think sentience is. And I think it ends up being an information process. Panpsychism is a bit different. That's a view that it exists to some extent in everything or virtually everything. And I think that can still be compatible with information processing, or what we call a functionalist view, where a rock has a direction that it's going if it's falling to the ground. It has potential and kinetic energy. It is moving. There is some semblance of a goal there. It has no mood. It has no complexity. Maybe you could say it has no integration. People are even talking about electrons and positive and negative charge in subatomic particles because they have a goal, they move in a certain direction, they have a tendency. I think you could say that's some, modicum of sentience, not enough to compete with the interests of even, let's say, insects as a class, who are just vastly more complex and more integrated, have mood-like states, and have much more sophisticated goals in that fourth category. Yeah. There's also substance dualism, particularly, which is that it's something like mass, something undergirding the nature of the universe.
A distinct separate property of some sort. Yeah.
Exactly, either a property or a substance. I think that you're hypothesizing that. It's that you're reifying it. It doesn't really exist. It's nice to imagine, similarly to Alain Vital in Life, as some substance undergirding it. It did make sense when we were talking about gold and metals, these things that ended up being elements. They are what we call, I'm getting into the philosophical jargon, but natural types or primitives. They're things that do exist in some really concrete way, like a gold atom is the same as a gold atom no matter where it is. But I don't think those views are particularly plausible. I think they are imaginable, and perhaps one day we'll figure out that, hey, when I take this, the Higgs boson, in a sense, gives particles mass. If there's a Higgs boson for consciousness, and I take that out of my brain, and I'm like, oh yeah, everything's the same. I'm functioning the same, processing the same information, but nothing I feel matters now. I think that's extremely unlikely, but it is imaginable. And I think we would need to account for that in our definition of sentience and consciousness.
Yeah, agree. And I think for me personally, again, I'm an amateur in this field, but it feels like another one of those spaces where there's no reason why we should be able to find the perfect answer to these questions, or indeed any, natural question. So it is a position where the perfect can be the enemy of the good. And I think it's quite good just to approach it with humility, keep working it out, keep doing the research and forming and reforming probabilistic beliefs. But there is something that is understandably so distinctly special about our own experience, right? That is the only thing that we viscerally know exists for ourselves. And of course, it is everything to us, that it can lead people to jump, I think, to fill the uncertainty with something that feels more definite. And a lot of thinking in this field seems to be motivated by a sort of general sense of, I just feel too special to just be physics. Oh, yeah. And I think we probably just are. So we should just get used to it. And there's still much to find out, but let's not jump ahead and let's just keep working on the evidence. So
yeah, I've got a paper right now on consciousness eliminativism, a specific view I'm calling Semanticism, because it's focused on the imprecision of definitions of meaning of semantics. And the ending of that paper is somewhat poetic and saying that there's nothing magical, there's nothing ununderstandable, inaccessible, ineffable, as philosophers like to say, about our conscious experience. But that's a really cool thing. Like the fact that
that's even more awesome.
Understand everything that is going on in our heads. That's way more exciting to me than this hard problem of something inaccessible on the other side of some impassable gap, which I just don't think there's evidence for.
Yeah, I agree. I think reality is much more awesome than anything we might make up. Yeah. That's been fascinating. Thank you. So we've answered two really easy questions. What's real and what matters morally already. And the final question is about the future. I asked some of my guests to try and take a sort of utopian cast and say, look, if you could imagine that we flipped a switch and all 8 billion humans became, one, both naturalistic in their way of thinking about the world, and two, had a sentiocentric compassion, regardless of how people might prioritize differently, but at least they'd set that moral consideration in that way. What sort of more utopian, better world could we get to? And most of my guests then drag me back to much more pragmatic concerns about human psychology and indoctrination and social norms and the frustrations of driving social change and so on. So you can take whatever tack you like in thinking about framing the future and how we might get to a better one. But I don't know where you'd like to start.
Yeah, I think practically speaking, what people would first do in that situation is figure out that future humans and aliens or artificial intelligences or other actors in the world might not continue to have their sentientist, naturalist view. So they would start to take steps to figure out how to ensure that. Can they set up maybe their own system of indoctrination for good, that keeps that stable as time goes on, and then figure out when they expand into the universe, how they continue it at an interstellar scale. For example, if they're sending out colonization ships that are trying to build utopias on other worlds, how do they ensure that those extremely distant societies that are perhaps going so far away that they can't even communicate, how do they maintain that sort of ideology?
So you want your von Neumann probes to have a sentience detector and to value sentience where they find it.
Exactly. There's this tricky question. Would you want to lock things in some way, as we alluded to earlier with church and pub lock-ins, but there is a concept of value lock-in, which we also discussed in the paper, of whether we want to and how we deal with the fact that at some point there might be, some people like to call it a singleton, kind of a world government or a single AI determining everything. And this becomes dangerous in some ways. As we were talking about with the vagueness of sentience, it's easy to think, okay, what would we do with a super intelligent AI? We would just program it to be sentientists and naturalists. And great, now we've solved all the problems. But that's really hard to program in, and we might get that wrong. Yeah. So we might want to have it have some extrapolation or interpretation or iteration that refines that and better gets to what we really mean, and rather than what we're able to express in computer code or in a...
And I like to joke that we've got a better chance of persuading a future super capable artificial general intelligence to be a sentientist than to be a humanist, because it won't be human. So at least sentientism includes itself in moral consideration.
Exactly. Yeah. And then in terms of, let's say we're limited to Earth and we're limited to the utopia they can build within 100 years, or what happens once they get all these practical problems solved and figure out how to do the von Neumann probes. I think hedonium, and it's the smallest possible unit of happiness and the most efficient use of, probably it would be energy, but you could think of it in terms of the most efficient use of matter or volume of space or some other resource. And some people think that's some sort of computer circuitry. It could be a simulation in which there is, I think of dog parks. I have 2 dogs. I also have a chicken. I am anti-speciesist in my own household, but the dogs just love being at the dog park. And this is wonderful. And it feels in a visceral way happier than you almost ever see humans. Just the pure enjoyment of running around, sniffing and playing with other dogs. So I think you maybe want them to be artificial because biological entities are really inefficient. Maybe you carpet the world with dog parks of some sort. It's obviously a much trickier question. It's probably going to be something more sophisticated than that. You also want other parts of the system that are taking care of them. Like you're probably going to want some entities whose job it is in some way to maintain the system. What if an asteroid comes by on Earth? Or what if a star goes supernova in the Milky Way galaxy? How do we ensure that we continue having these dog parks going on? We might want to deal with non-utilitarian sentientist perspectives who would say people need to be well-informed and able to choose among many different, let's say, dog park-like utopias. David Pierce speaks of gradients of bliss that people can access.
Yeah.
So you might have a bunch of different environments running on the Earth or in the galaxy, and people can pick and choose between them. The creation of new beings becomes tricky and gets into population ethics. And again, some of these things just aren't determined if you're solely sentientist. I'm saying it from my own view as a utilitarian sentient. But nonetheless, I again want to be cooperative. And I think all of these outcomes are great. And I'm not going to pick and choose too much between my gradients of bliss once we've, let's say, eliminated the extreme suffering.
Yeah. Thank you. And to draw, so that's a nice utilitarian, always utopian framing for where we might be able to get to. And if I draw you back to some of the more immediate concerns that you're focused on with moral circle expansion, and whether we think about the challenges with intrahuman ethics, that we're still, massively unfinished work there, as we can see as we look around the world today, as we think about the challenges of course, animal farming, subject of your great book. We think about wild animal suffering. We think about these sort of classes of the sentient beings that exist today and the problems that are facing them. What's your view about, again, partly an end state for those that we could get to? But then I guess we get onto the tougher question, which is, unfortunately, that magic switch of just persuading everyone to agree with us is not available. And the hard moral work of philosophy and describing stuff and explaining things doesn't drive social change very quickly, or certainly not quickly enough for my mind. So in those more, practical, immediate concerns, I'm interested in your latest view of how we can productively drive change on those topics as well.
Yeah, this is what I research on a day-to-day basis. It's kind of social change strategy and mechanisms. And I'm curious for your views on this too, Jamie, but I've become more optimistic about technology. It's kind of been a while now. That was definitely before I published the book. You engage in these activist circles. You look at people just banging on the doors and saying, if slaughterhouses were vegetarian, or sorry, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian, showing people these videos. And that seeds society in an important way. It gets conversations started. It takes, you think of this diffusion of innovations curve and the innovators who adopt a new sneaker, a new brand, or a new moral trend, and they're adopting veganism, the hardcore animal rights philosophy, but that hits pretty quickly diminishing returns because not that many people in society are willing to go in such a strong moral direction. They're just not, most people aren't very morally driven. They have many other things pushing and pulling their behavior. So I think we're at a point now where we need to start reaching the early adopters, which I think is the first 15%, something like that, and then the early majority and getting up to 50%, which I hope we'll get to by 2050. And I think for that, we need a lot of technology, in part because we've neglected. If we're starting at no discussion of factory farming today, no vegan food products or whatever, maybe we need to have that moral seeding. But at this point, we've had so much of that, so many investigations, that I'm really excited about these new companies offering products that can capitalize on that moral and social momentum that we've created. However, I should qualify that and say that one of the things we've researched at Sentience Institute is, for example, genetically modified foods and nuclear energy and biofuels, technologies that have largely failed to be adopted, despite humanitarians and scientists thinking they are very clear ways of doing a lot of good in the world. So if we focus entirely on that technology, we can, for example, get in this situation where Friends of the Earth is an environmental group that's opposed GMOs a lot, and as opposed to even the Impossible Foods use of genetic engineering to create their, like a hemoglobin, a product in their burgers. It's not genetically engineered in the burger itself, but it's genetic engineering they use in the process. They've pushed back against that. So if you end up getting this dynamic like we saw with GMOs, where it's big corporate companies and technology against moral activists, environmentalists, that's a terrible public battle to be in. It's very hard for the corporate part to win. So anyway, we're going to continue to need activism. It's just a matter of what the balance is now and where we should allocate more resources. And I'm most excited about corporate and technology and business, and as well as institutional processes of social change, such as legislation. I'm really excited that Cory Booker in the US Senate now has a bill of a 2040 moratorium on large factory farms. The UK is, now that they're independent, recognizing sentient beings to at least some capacity. That's certainly a symbolic gesture, but a good milestone nonetheless. Those are promising as well and have been neglected.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think I share that similar view. In a sense, on the non-human animal sentiocentric side, I came to the game quite late. So in a way, I'm an example of how long it can take even someone who I think is reasonably thoughtful and quite moral to, recognize these things. So we've got busy lives and we're working on different stuff and we have different priorities and we defend ourselves with cognitive dissonance because there's some things we just don't want to think about because we know it'll take us to a difficult or a weird or a socially challenging place. So I try and use that to have compassion for other people that still don't recognize these things fully, or if they recognize them, don't act on them, because I was one of those people not so long ago. But at the same time, when you do recognize these challenges, right, when you finally understand the depth of the challenge in wild animal suffering or farmed animal, particularly in farmed animal suffering, because it's something we do deliberately, we're choosing every day to drive, it's such a viscerally horrific thing that the instinctive response is one of righteousness and opprobrium and shock and horror. And you can understand where the emotion behind the typical angry vegan, and I can be one sometimes, where that comes from, right? It is in a way an appropriate feeling. And it's one that wouldn't be criticized if it was related to a human social change movement either. It's like you're supposed to be outraged. But at the same time, it's quite clear that expressing that does shift some people, might seed, it might shift people's thinking. Shame can be effective, but it's only with a very small number of people and very slowly. So I think we're almost in a situation where you have to deliberately take on another form of cognitive dissonance deliberately with full awareness, where you say, look, I'm going to bottle that up inside because I need to be, if I want to try and help end that problem, I need to be effective. And to be effective, I need to find other ways that are going to recognize the social power and the indoctrination that most people on the planet go through on these topics, that recognize they've got busy lives, and that leads you to, as you were saying, maybe some technical solutions and some normalization solutions that make it practically and societally easier for people to do the right thing. And as their behavior shifts and as their practices shift with help, it almost frees them to then improve their morals and their ethics and snap into place and recognize maybe an underlying ethics that they always had, because most people don't want to needlessly cause suffering to any sentient being. And some of your research at Sentience Institute helped expose some of that maybe latent human ethic, right? The work you did around public views on factory farming had surprisingly high percentages of people who buy from factory farms but think they're unethical, right? So there's almost a latent ethic we can tap into if we can technically and societally make it easier for people to be better. I should stop rambling on, but
no, that's really good points. We need anger and outrage. There are just specific funnels in which it is a lot more effective. If we're talking about these institutional processes and campaigning for the UK or US legislation to change, or even getting companies to change individually and protesting and things like that, we need impetus. We need moral impetus. We need a reason to create those big social cacophonies, because if we're just doing that for our own personal, hey, I just think this is better, I just like animals, that doesn't get you the same strength and compellingness in society. It doesn't show, for example, that you're anti-speciesist and you're thinking of these animals as really moral patients, moral beings in their own. It's just when it comes to diet change in particular, and because that's such a strong association now, even if in my day-to-day interaction with people, I very rarely bring up my own diet or their diet. I'm almost always talking about, hey, there's this huge issue now. I think it's one of the most important problems of the 21st century. And I think we as social scientists or as entrepreneurs, depending on who I'm talking to, can be the forerunners of this new social movement. And that's just far more exciting and does involve this indignation of what's happening right now. But as soon as diet comes into it, I'm just like, oh, yeah, that's fun. I tried this cool new product and I code switch, as a sociologist would say. And I think that can be more effective for most of the time. We need, again, a plethora of voices. We need radical flanks. So if some people are doing that, it's okay. It also happens as the movement matures, not just in the age of its members, but also in just the length of time that the average member has been involved. Once you're 10 years into your veganism, oftentimes you're able to at least do that code switching, even if you still feel outrage and indignation, as you should. And that's what makes you a moral pioneer.
Yeah. And I think another reason why that moral drive is needed as well is to make sure we stay on track, because there's obviously sometimes quite vicious debates within the animal advocacy movement around abolition versus welfare versus different approaches. Is reducing suffering incrementally good because it's reducing the suffering, or is it bad because it's enabling an awful suffering to continue and potentially scale? And I think some of those debates are maybe a little misplaced, because I think many people, whether they have a more welfarist or a more abolitionist or whatever their philosophy is about how to drive the change, share the end goal, which is no exploitation, or, to your book, the end of animal farming in a sense, and they're just disagreeing about how to get there. But one of the reasons people are concerned about the sort of welfarist approach is whether there is a dead end there somewhere. And you can imagine in the public consciousness some future where we've wound down factory farming. We now have ethical farming where animals live happy lives and are euthanized peacefully in their sleep. And we found some way to convince ourselves it's okay. And that becomes an endpoint that still is horrific. So I think that's partly why we still need the moral drive to make sure we stay on track, and that fine incremental steps. It's good to have something less bad than more bad, but ultimately if something's still bad, we want to keep working. So I think it's important from that perspective too. And I also like as you said, you need to pull on so many different levers as well, right? There isn't a single answer. Handing out leaflets, watching Cowspiracy, making the Impossible Burger, changing laws, lobbying corporates, lobbying NGOs, lobbying supranational organizations, lobbying governments, all of those things. We can pull all those levers at once.
Yeah. And I mentioned one of the most important pages on our website is foundational question summaries. We've got welfare versus reform, or what we call momentum versus complacency, as those two possible effects you can imagine from welfare reforms. Does it spur further change? I like to think that if we got to the point where we're no longer factory farming animals, that would just create a lot of moral sentiment in society that, hey, we really care about animals. That would then inevitably spur us towards the actual end of factory farming. This is also a practical view based on the fact that if you were to get rid of factory farming, meat would be incredibly expensive, done at a very small scale, and would actually consume a lot more resources in some ways. Like you would have to have more space per animal, more land and more water and those sorts of things. But nonetheless, that resource has both sides of the argument. And we're currently running a study where we show people news on factory farming, information on bad and the good, whatever, and then either show them more information about a welfare reform. Hey, here's how the system has been improving or not. And then we have a host of metrics for seeing how that affects people's reactions. Do they think, oh, okay, so now it's okay for me to consume eggs? Or do they now think, hey, okay, farmed animals matter to us and to society, and we're creating change for them. So then there's an identity shift where then they care more about them. I think cognitive dissonance is just an undercurrent of almost every farmed animal issue. where the fact that we're eating animals, the fact that we're mistreating animals, the fact that we exclude them from our legal frameworks all perpetuates the further consumption and abuse. It's a really vicious cycle. But the flip side of that is that it will become a very virtuous cycle when we create those positive changes, because they'll reinforce each other.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess is that where your optimism comes from, that you can see things shifting already and you can see the pieces moving? And
yeah, I am an optimist, I think, in this regard, but it depends on who I'm talking to, in the sense that I say animal farming will end globally by the end of the century. It's my best guess. But many vegans say, oh, that's so far away. Or they'll say the climate, 12 years and we'll all be dying from climate change. How can you think that it'll take so long? Whereas if I'm talking to lay people or other academics, for example, they always think the end of the century is rather quick. But nonetheless, I do think a lot of it is that cycle. I think right now we're laying a lot of foundation that's very important. I think that, for example, Omniport, which is a wonderful company in China doing plant-based pork. So it's not the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger. It's not catered towards this all-American Western audience. It's catered towards the dim sum and the pork balls. Are very popular in particularly southern China, but across East Asia. They just reached price parity. I saw this on a headline. I don't know the details. It's always a question of price parity with what. The Impossible Burger is cheaper than a lot of burgers, but it's still much more expensive than the meat most people are buying. As soon as you reach those points where it becomes price no longer becomes such an inhibition, that can be very exciting. And I think up until 2025, this is the timeline I've given. It's the first quarter of the century. It's building foundation, just getting these technologies in place. Then around 2025, you get these virtuous cycles, as I've discussed, and they certainly are happening in some contexts. And then after 2050, ideas are spreading, manufacturing is just spreading around the world. And by 2075 to 2100, then you're having a stigmatization where kind of eking out the last bits of the incomes, and some, of the poorest countries around the world are increasing such that they can afford these newer meat alternatives. Right now, then it's very much a first high-income country problem with the US and Europe. But nonetheless, I'm overall optimistic, and I think it's important to speculate and have different timelines. People can very reasonably disagree with me, but having this long-term sensibility both facilitates this bigger picture of moral circle expansion, ensuring that we don't just end factory farming and then, as he said, there's a dead end for wild animals or other groups. So it facilitates that big picture, and it keeps us on track and keeps us motivated. It's very easy for us to get lost in the day-to-day challenges of animal activism and forget the fact that Beyond Meat had a $14 billion IPO in 2019. That is incredible and unprecedented. And that news gets lost much more quickly than the negatives.
Yeah. No, I agree. It's an inspiring, hopeful story. One of the other challenges that we'll often hear when we're talking about non-human animal topics is that there's a trade-off against human challenges, right? So some people will say, look, we shouldn't be focusing there. We've got so much to deal with within the human species already. That should be where we prioritize, even if theoretically we have a broader scope of moral consideration. How do you respond to that challenge? Do you think there is really a trade-off there, or is there a complementarity between these topics as you expand the circle? Yeah,
mostly complementarity. That's one of the arguments in the paper is expansion begets expansion. The more we care about a group, the more we become a generally inclusive species. There are different models of that. You can think of us as having a moral tank that we spend fuel out of, and at some point it runs out and we can't include anyone else. I don't think there's a lot of precedent for that, just from the abolition of chattel slavery in the in the UK, and then subsequently other places. That seems to have facilitated further change. The first animal rights or animal welfare organizations like the RSPCA and the Massachusetts SPCA were started by anti-slavery activists. And we saw this continuation in a larger scale version of that momentum that's complacency that we were talking about. And I think that's overall the view. I think there are challenges and movement dynamics when it comes to the specifics. So, for example, there's this phenomenon of suspicious convergence where a lot of animal activists will say that, veganism is also the healthiest diet, the most sustainable diet in every way, all these benefits, better for workers, et cetera, et cetera. It would be really surprising if it were the better on all of those categories. Yeah. I have one essay where I discuss this, and I say that some of these are connected. The fact that animals are wasteful, they do a lot of things other than produce the meat, dairy, and eggs that we want them to do. That leads to several issues. That's the source of suffering. That's the source of, in general, environmental inefficiency. The fact that feed ratios are very high. You put in a lot more calories or even a lot more protein into the animal than you get out in an animal product. So those we might suspect will correlate. But with nutrition, for example, I think there's this very murky and complicated history with the stigmatization of fat, which was very much done for non-scientific reasons, partly social reasons. That happens to be the name of the food and what we get when we eat too much, or the nutrition problem, at least in the US, rather than a refined sugar, for example, which is typically vegan, corn syrup, something like that, but has a lot of the same evidence of some problem, saturated fat in particular. I'm not as convinced of the evidence. So I try to stay away from those when possible. Fortunately, we can still say there are good public health arguments. They're just not the, in particular, nutrition arguments. They're instead about asthma rates and cancer rates get very high around animal farms. In general, environmental consequences can lead to negative health consequences. And there's overconsumption of just eating too many calories in this kind of junk food apparatus and stuff. But I try to steer away from the things that genuinely just, again, as naturalists focus on evidence and reason, we might not want to rely on, even as what I call black magic or something, or invoking this thing that we don't actually believe, but we think is a good activism tool. I think that's we should steer clear of that in general, because it leads to a lot of bad dynamics within the movement and a bad sentiment as we fight for future issues. And we were seen as dishonest on one issue, et cetera. It's good to maintain this general honest focus. And acknowledging the trade-offs. Like the fact that, just one brief thing is with the displacement of farmers. And there are good ways to use the resources we get from switching to an animal-free food system to support humans transitioning in their careers. And we're already seeing the hereditariness, that the amount to which children follow their parents in a farming profession has dropped off dramatically, just because it's dying both in its industrializing there are few farmers and dying in this particular sense of animal agriculture. And that is just a trade-off. It's something we have to face. Almost all new technologies displace, whether it's computers displacing professional typewriters. It's just going to happen, and that's okay. It's something we acknowledge and need to just cope with. It's part of moral progress.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the way you framed it. And that's another reason that this naturalistic commitment is important, because one, it stops you going down the Wooganism route and the sort of wishful thinking route and the telling a story that isn't really well founded, which can sap credibility from a movement, but also to face the technical opportunities and look for those positive trade-offs and assess them accurately as well. In many cases, there is genuinely a win there. But at the same time, I think as a movement, and this is one of the reasons I liked your book so much, is because I think because the argument is shifting more and more quickly now, it's not enough just to complain about the problems that exist today. We need to get better at actually explaining how things are going to work and how we're going to transition. And that needs to face up to some of those trade-offs and those challenges. So whether it's thinking about things like transformation and the rancher advocacy program and taking government subsidies for meat and dairy and redirecting them to funding a just transition to help people find a different lifestyle and a different way of living, or whether it's recognizing the particular challenges of certain communities that have a high dependence on animal farming or fishing and how we're going to work that through, right? These are not intractable problems, but they are problems that we need to face up to. And I think because we're winning the argument and making progress, we need to put more effort into really telling the story about how that's going to work and planning it out.
Yeah, and people often have a background in arts, literature, and then come into effective altruism or animal advocacy and wonder where there's a place for them. It can be hard to see because so much of it is mathematical and utilitarian in the other sense of the word. But that's a big part of where we need is designing these futures. That's been a big part of many historical social movements, was imagining or writing fluently about some issue. And we've got these two books. We've got Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer and The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, which is not quite a vegan book, but is exposing the issues of factory farming. And those are still, as far as I know, the books that tend to get people involved. Animal liberation gets people involved in the more general rights thing more so. But we don't have very many books that have become a pillar, have become a beacon in the future to look to and explain what's happening. My book isn't quite there in the sense that it's more transition, it's more social science of how we'll get there. But I think we just genuinely need fiction and urban design and biologists and whomever to design these futures. I should say the Cellular Agriculture Society, among these nonprofits that are cultivating this new industry, has really focused on this. And is even there, Chris Gastorados has even made the argument that we shouldn't define in words cultured meat. Our go-to description shouldn't be here's how we describe it, here's the term we use. It should just be a visual. We should just any chance we get, show people this. It's futuristic, but it's got these natural elements. And it's just such a clear contrast to a factory farm. And that should be the thesis, the one-liner, rather than a description, should just be an image.
Yeah. And some of the graphics they've got on their website already are really worth looking at because it gives you a sense of where that could go. And I think
they want to work.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. There is a sense that some of these causes, whether it's utilitarian focus or effective altruism, or even more broadly sentientism, can feel quite cold and calculating. And we have a spreadsheet and we can also feel quite negative. We're focused on suffering and reducing suffering and these awful, terrible problems. And that can have a feel to it. But there's also a deeply inspirational side to it as well. There's a sort of David Deutschian future possibility. Some of my guests have talked about Star Trek, post-scarcity, compassionate future, and more pragmatically, just more compassionate ways of living on this planet that are within reach. And often the problem is less a technical one and is more one of social change and weird human psychology. So it's brilliant to have you focusing so hard on spanning all of those deep problems. And on the one hand, helping us find ways of fixing the problems of today, but also making sure that through moral circle expansion, we don't create future problems too, whether it's mass scale insect farming or S-risks or farmers of suffering artificial intelligences. Yeah.
Have you heard of the existential hope as contrasted to existential risk?
Yes. Yeah. So I've had a couple of conversations with the Foresight Institute recently. That's one of the themes of their work. And I love that. Again, it's about painting a picture of the future, not just in a technical sense, but in a cultural sense and in an artistic sense as well. Yeah. So maybe that's something else we need to think about in terms of the framing of the movement is, existential hope first. And that's a more positive way of drawing people in and building momentum. And of course, squashing the existential risks and the awful problems we perpetuate at the moment. It's been absolutely fascinating to talk to you. Thank you so much. I could have gone for hours. And are there any other things you'd like to layer into the conversation before we wrap up?
No, I'd encourage people to find resources for their reading on our website or on your website. For example, on shame, there's a book, Is Shame Necessary by Jennifer Jaquette at New York University, NYU. On most of these topics, there's a lot more to explore, and people can feel free to send me a message on Twitter or email or whatever, and I can point them in the direction of further reading.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Well, I will include your Twitter links and the Sentience Institute links and the others in the show notes, of course.
Great. So good to chat with you.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. About time. And thank you again for all the work you're doing. Great to talk to you, Jacy.
Thanks.